Welcome to another episode of the Heritage Buildings Podcast. I'm Vincent Reed, your host. Before I formally introduce my guest, I want to share a quick story with you. I was 20 years old, and like many at that age, I was looking for a new job. I wasn't particularly serious about it at the time, but I managed to land a position as an apprentice antique furniture restorer in a shop in Ship Street in Brighton. The shop was called Michael Norman Antiques. On my first day, I remember arriving at the workshop, which was tucked away behind the showroom. The workshops were on 3 levels, and to get to them, you had to go down the alley, through a side door, and climb up a narrow set of stairs. Now, I was incredibly fortunate because this company restored some truly exceptional pieces of furniture. But at the time, I didn't really appreciate it. I didn't realise how lucky I was. But looking back, it was an amazing opportunity for me. So, dragging my tool chest behind me, I was guided to the room where I was going to be working. We passed through several small rooms, each bustling with activity. There were cabinet makers, French polishers, carvers, all working in these small workshops. So eventually, I arrived at the room, and it was there that I met the person who was going to train me. My workbench was set up very close to his, and back then, this was the way you learned. You were just shadowed by somebody with a lot of experience, and you just basically just got stuck in. Now, as I entered the room, I vividly remember being absolutely blown away to see my future mentor reproducing an intricately carved Chippendale style chair. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and I thought to myself, how on earth is he doing that? And to think that this incredibly talented person was going to teach me was such an honour, and I learnt a huge amount during my time there. So today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome this person to the podcast. And it's my great privilege to introduce my colleague and dear friend, Mr. Mark Cooper. Now, Mark is a classically trained conservator and restorer of antique furniture and decorative arts and has a career spanning decades. Mark's journey started on England's south coast, where he refined his craft before relocating to the United States in the 1990s to join Sotheby's. Here he applied his expertise at some of the world's finest antique furniture. Now at the helm of Cooper & Company in the village of Catskill in the USA, Mark continues his dedication to the craft, restoring period English and American furniture and decorative arts, and curating a remarkable collection of antiques. With a passion for traditional methods and a deep respect for history, Mark is here to share insights into his fascinating career. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
It's
a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited. This is really good. So
we're going to share some stories today.
We are going to share some stories. You don't know quite what's lined up, but I want to go over some interesting questions. And what I want to do is really get an insight into what it's like to be an antique furniture restorer at the highest level, because it's such a dying trade now that it's just going to be really interesting for our viewers to hear your story and hopefully all the methods and techniques that we're going to be discussing. So let's start at the beginning.
Right at the beginning, I was able to get a job at a company not far away from Michael Norman as an apprentice woodcarver for a company that made oak reproduction furniture, very good quality reproduction furniture. And I started to learn wood carving. And about a year or two after I'd worked there, I was on a motorcycling trip in the West Country and met another group of guys who were all working together and touring together from Pulborough in West Sussex. And they were all antique restorers, French polishers and cabinet makers. And I went to see them and ended up working there. That's how the restoration business That's how I started in the restoration business. I was probably 18 or 19, maybe, very young. And I met this group of guys in a pub, of course. And they said, why don't you come and work for us? And that was the beginning of learning some incredibly valuable skills in terms of restoration, recreation, color, patination, all that sort of thing. And tool skills, which I think is rather lacking. Being able to, there are just things I learned in those early days, as you described with the Ship Street job. You don't know what you're learning and how lucky you were to be taught by people until you're much older. And then you look back on your career and think, wow, that was such a fortunate place I was so fortunate to be working at that place at that period of my life. They set the standards when you're working with those kind of people, when you're surrounded by talented people. I think it sets the standard for the rest of your career.
Mm. And how old were you? I'm sorry, what year was it when you were 18?
1978.
1978. Wow.
Yeah.
And did you learn so you learned to carve in the reproduction? Do you remember what that was called, that company?
It was called Mellocraft, I think.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
And actually, a few of the people that worked at Michael Norman Antiques also came from there. They were cabinet makers. So there were familiar faces at Michael Norman.
Ah. And then what was the company? Yeah, sorry, go on.
I think that Michael Norman was important. You know, it was important for you, but I think it was important for most of us because there were such skillful people, so talented, and the quality of the furniture and the objects of decorative art at that antique dealer was on another level. They were beautiful, rare pieces of furniture. And I look back on that and think again how fortunate we were to be able to work on such beautiful things without incredible pressures of time, and the pieces just had to be done correctly. That was the most important thing, that the work was executed correctly.
Yeah. And did you, in those early days, you went from the reproduction company, and then what was the company called? The Antique Furniture Restoration Company. Were they dealers as well, or were they just restorers?
They were just restorers. They were called Monday and Garner. There were 3 or 4 of us, that was all. But these were really passionate craftspeople who could reproduce legs of lowboys and taught me how to make chairs and introduced me to those kind of skills that you often I don't think you see those skills as much anymore. But I remember seeing one of the partners making a base for a chest on stand, and I was, in a similar way that you were fascinated by the chair that I was making, I was fascinated by seeing somebody carving beautiful cabriole legs and recreating the cross-grain moldings, and how incredibly clever it was to recreate the color and the pattern and make a whole new stand for an upper cabinet that was completely missing. They weren't copying something. There was nothing to copy, but it was just, and the color and the patination and the methods used to recreate the color and the patination was just incredible. It was really hard to tell that it was a reproduction base for this piece of furniture.
It's probably in an antique shop now. Original based.
Original base. It was, if I remember correctly, a lot of the interior casewoods were old pieces of wood. It wasn't made from new. You know, the legs were made from new walnut and the cross-grain moldings, but the casework was old. That's all I can say.
Yeah. And this was a time when, it was the antique boom, wasn't it? In the late 70s, early 80s, and all through the 80s and early 90s, that was just absolutely a huge boom with the antique furniture. And also, a lot of it was going over to the States, being shipped over there. So there was, it was a very, very busy industry. Some of it was honest, some of it wasn't so honest. But it was just back in those days.
I think there was a lot of careful wording of descriptions of pieces of furniture. Yeah, I think of a later date was used quite often.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, of a later date.
Last week.
And you started carving, then you went to the furniture restoring workshop. Did you at the start just have a natural aptitude for it? Did you have to really work hard, or did you just find that it just came to you naturally?
Well, I was always artistic, loved creating things. And I, in fact, stayed on at school to resit some exams, but I really wanted to be in the wood shop and the metal shop. And I wanted to continue with art. But I didn't go to art college, but I was brought up in a family, of course, Arthur Hobbs and Michael Hobbs, my father and grandfather, were traditionally trained carpenters. And so I was always surrounded by things being made. It might have been not so much furniture, but doors and staircases, and traditional carpentry was something that I grew up watching. And the village in which you and I grew up had a lot of that going on. If you remember rightly, there was a proper farrier. Alan Miles was working in the high street, and there was a blacksmith and farrier in the street. So I think that when you're surrounded by that level of skill and creativity, my mother was an artist. My paternal father was an artist. My grandfather was a carpenter. My stepfather was a carpenter. I think that it's just a world of interest when you're constantly watching people be very clever. And I think it was inevitable that I would end up doing something like that. But I loved working with wood. It was doing wood carving obviously taught me some skills that would be useful to me later on, making chairs, for example. But I think that that's the way my life was destined to go. And even if I grumble about some of the jobs I get now as an older man, I still enjoy it. I just grumble. I still enjoy what I'm doing.
What I find interesting, and you talking about always seeing people making things and are surrounded by that. The village that we grew up in, which is Henfield in West Sussex, I would guess that during that time, the 70s and the 80s, the majority of the people living there were creators and hands-on workers, the majority.
Yeah.
And if you now visit the village, the majority would be, office working in the city, commuting. So that's the big change. And that's in a really, really short space of time. We're talking about 40 years. And that has literally just changed.
I think there's a bit of a crisis that was somewhat inevitable.
Yeah.
And when I worked in England, I wouldn't be inundated, but I would have enquiries from people leaving school to see if there were any trainee or apprentice positions. And the one thing I've noticed here, even though I knew the careers counsellor at the local high school, there was just an incredible lack of interest. Young people are driven towards or guided towards the tech industries or accountancy or becoming lawyers, but there seem to be very few people who are even interested in learning how to make furniture or do furniture conservation or restoration.
Well, that's a subject that we're going to come on to a little bit further in, because it's a really, really important discussion. But right, could you now, because this is such a dying trade and a dying art, could you just give a brief overview of what an antique furniture restorer does, and what abilities you need to be a restorer?
What abilities do you need to be a restorer? Well, you need some tool skills. I think that's discovered very early on. With somebody on work experience, you could tell very quickly whether somebody had a natural aptitude to using woodworking tools. And if they really had no experience, you could also tell very quickly how fast they would learn if you show a young person how to do something.
How interesting. Some
people pick it up very quickly, and some people, they look like they've got two left hands. They cut themselves a lot, and some of these tools, of course, are very sharp, and some people just have a natural aptitude. And in the same way that somebody might have a natural aptitude to understanding the mechanics of a car, some people are. I think that in life, that's one of the big things, is discovering where your skills lie and what's going to make you, what you're going to enjoy and what you're going to be passionate about. Because I think to be a good furniture restorer, you not only need to be passionate about the craft and the skills required, but you also need to be quite passionate about history, learning how something should be constructed or designed in what period. I think has been very important to me. In what I'm trying to say is that you need to know what something should look like. in order to recreate it.
Yeah.
You can't recreate something if you have no idea what the color should be like and what the finish should be, what's appropriate. It's an art. It's definitely, in my opinion, it's an art. And we're the old guys in the business. And I think that we need more young people in the business, very much so.
It's also what a lot of people don't realize. You have to be sort of multi-skilled. So if we look at the sort of list of, we can go through them. When I trained, I had to learn how to cut keys for locks, take a lock apart, rebuild a lock, soldering and brazing, how to cut incredibly thin, delicate glass. And if it was the original antique glass, you had to be incredibly careful. There was carving, there were leather work as well, wasn't there? There was, you had to know how to do leather work. And then there'd be polishing. So, learning how to French polish, for instance, and wax polish. There was so much to it. I think that's why it takes such a long time to learn, because there is so much to learn. There's so many sort of facets to it.
It's interesting do you say that, because I actually wasn't trained to do polishing work. And the reason I ended up becoming quite well known as a person able to recreate patina in color was because I couldn't find anyone to do it the way I wanted it done. I wanted a very specific look, especially with period English furniture. I really wanted a specific look, and I tried to find people to do that here. And everything I found out or asked other restorers to, polishers to do, would end up looking like a Steinway piano. Everything was super shiny, and I could never get polishers to understand that I wanted something to look soft and waxy, and I didn't want it to look new. I wanted them to introduce dirt, if you like. I wanted the details of the carvings or the details of the moldings. I wanted them to look naturally dirty.
Yeah.
I didn't want it to look new. So I taught myself how to do it at a relatively late stage in my career. That was how I got it to be how I wanted it to be. And there's a whole conversation there about perceptions of conservation and restoration.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know. We'll definitely talk about that. But what's interesting to me hearing you speak is that way of thinking, with keeping the dirt and the grime and it not being too glossy. And this is exactly what I promote. Now, you must have instilled that in me when I was training, because I wouldn't have got it from anybody else. And I think when we used to talk back then and about things being over restored and over polished, and it was always this subject that stayed with me, because I'm just like you. I would prefer to see something just nice and just a lovely sort of dull sheen wax with dents and scratches and some dirt and some original finish and patination. It's trying to, I think what happened was that was the American market probably influenced the way people were restoring furniture, because the American market demanded things to be nice and bright and shiny. And that was their taste. So therefore, everybody got taught, like, what's that French polish that people used to use? It was a really, really high gloss type of French polish. But anyway, they were encouraged to use this to really make the furniture very, very bright and shiny. But it's great because you obviously didn't like that and had a completely different thought. That rubbed off on me. And I truly believe that has made me very different when I go to projects and speak to clients and say, look at this wonderful dirt and grime. It's just fantastic. And they say, why? Why is that fantastic? Why don't we want to clean it? So
it's
that's thanks to you.
By pure coincidence, when you used to visit my house in Brighton, you used to admire a table that I'd bought, a William IV mahogany drop leaf table.
Okay.
It had never been restored, and it's right here.
Oh, is it?
And it's still never been restored. It's still got a split in the top. I've had several people want to buy the table if I restored it, and I wouldn't sell it to them because I just don't want to restore this table. It's got all the marks of life and practical use. It's a beautiful piece of furniture, but it's got a big crack in the top. But what a lot of people don't understand is that restoring and repairing that crack would completely destroy the integrity of the color and the way the table looks, because you would have to do some woodwork, and you can't do woodwork without interfering with the integrity of the color and the polish.
Yeah.
So it still remains unwaxed, relatively unloved, but it's exactly how I bought it. And I bought it because nobody had restored it.
Yeah.
Everybody said to me, "Oh, you're a restorer. Are you going to restore that table?" Absolutely not.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Now, I got something for you to do now. I'm going to teleport a walnut bureau over to you via WeTransfer now, okay? And it's circa 1720, and it's going to be popped right in front of you, or let's say it's going to be in your workshop.
Yeah.
And so this, let me give it a bit of description to our viewers. This bureau, it's been in the family of Lady Worley Buckingham, made up name, and it was commissioned by one of her ancestors in 1720. It's never been restored. It has good patinations. However, there are mouldings that are loose and missing, and the drawer runners are worn. And it's arrived in your workshop now. What would be the first thing? So it's in front of you. What would you do as the first thing?
Put the kettle on.
No, I wasn't expecting you. That's not what I was expecting you to say.
You put the glue pot on. I was talking to Michael yesterday, my stepdad, and he said the first thing you do when you go in the workshop is put the glue pot on, the hide glue pot, and you put the kettle on. Then you sit down and look at the piece of furniture and just fall in love with the piece of furniture. Touch all the moldings, touch the sides, open and pull open and close the drawers, look at the handles, do the handles match? Are they the fifth set of handles that have been fitted to it? Are the feet correct? There's this early diagnosis going on where you're looking and loving the color, and I can see the moldings now, all cracked with shrinkage. The cross-grain moldings are always the way walnut shrinks. There's lots of them. There are pieces that have been glued on and are slightly out of line. There are pieces missing. The drawers won't open and close unless you lift them up and pull them open.
Yeah.
So, and there are big splits in the side. There are always splits in the casework down the sides of the piece of furniture. Do you leave them or do you fillet them? And that's something else that I'm inclined not to do anymore.
Yep.
I persuade my clients to leave them alone, because if you fillet the cracks in the casework, the next winter the heating goes on and they all crack again. And what have you achieved by filleting them? You've probably altered the color of the sides of the cabinet. So while you were making tea and we were looking at the piece of furniture and the
glue pot's on as well. And for people that don't know, a hot glue pot is animal glue that you have to heat up, and it's got a very distinctive smell. Now, anybody who works in the industry usually loves the smell, but anybody who comes in to a workshop and smells that, they are then keen at all. If it's
not fresh glue.
If it's not fresh glue, then it's very, very smelly. But yeah, that's a traditional animal glue that Mark's referring to.
It's still the thing to use, isn't it?
Yep.
It's just the most wonderful, and it's another skill in what the application is, how thick you need the glue for the application.
Mm-hmm.
You have to work with it very quickly, don't you?
Yeah.
Because it gels so fast.
Yeah.
It cools down and gels so quickly. So I'm still imagining this piece of furniture. Did you say it was a bureau with a cabinet?
It's just a bureau. So you've put the kettle on, you've had a cup of tea, you've looked at it, the glue pot's bubbling away, you're ready to go. And we've said that the drawers are worn, the drawer runners are worn, and it's got the cracks and the splits. Now you're going to start approaching the cabinet, and you need to now start working on it. What's number one, and how would you go about doing that? First job, and how would you do it?
Casework first, always. Okay. Remove loose moldings and place them in a position, perhaps on another table, so you know where all the pieces go. But they're typically, the cross-grain moldings are usually cupped and are coming off the cabinet. I would take the drawers out and address any problems with the integrity of the construction of the main case. So I'd probably take all the drawers out, have a look at the drawers, very controversial. This decision is about draw runners and kickers, replacing draw runners and kickers. Do you replace them? Do you leave them alone and fit secondary draw runners? Or do you dismantle the bottom of the drawer and replace the worn draw runners? Because if the kickers are not working, that's a miserable thing to use. Every time you pull the drawer open, the drawer wants to drop.
Yes, yeah. And they're both worn, aren't they? The kickers and the runners, they're worn equally. So it's, you can,
correct.
Yeah, you can replace one, but then you haven't replaced the other. So therefore you have to build up more wood on your runner, for instance. But it's
an interesting one because it leads into the conversation that we're probably going to talk about later, which is that whole conversation about high-end antique dealers selling very collectible furniture, and the museum's requirements are completely different. And I think there's a lot of discussion between restorers and conservators. And I think I rather think of myself as a conservative restorer because my clients have to use the piece of furniture. So if you approach something like this piece of furniture from the position of a conservator, you're really only going to stabilize the current condition and maybe wax it. But we're not talking about we're not talking about a museum. We're talking about something in somebody's house that they actually want to use. They're not going to be very happy lifting the drawers up and having that.
Yeah, it's always a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's horrible. It's horrible to redo runners. You have to, chisel them down, use the shoulder plane, and you're taking all that lovely original material off, and then you're putting some new on. And it's quite a heavy-handed approach, but it's the only way you can do it.
It is really, because in the same way that you were talking about the American market, people don't want a tacky looking piece of furniture in their house. They've either bought it from a dealer because it's beautifully restored and super shiny, or they're asking me to go and look at it and I give them advice. And I find quite often that I'm almost trying to persuade people to leave it alone as much as possible, but to make it functional. And in making it functional, you're almost contradicting yourself because you've got to replace the drawer runners and make sure the kickers are working and make sure the locks are working. And with a restoration like that, there's an inevitable amount of dismantling, which is, if you like, interfering with. It's invasive. Yeah. Conservators talk about non-invasive restoration, which is wonderful. Who would disagree with that? But in the real world, where you're selling furniture to people who want the furniture to work properly, things have got to work. The locks have got to work. The drawers have got to open and close properly. Anyway, I would start with pulling the drawers out, tipping the piece of furniture out on its back and having a look underneath to check that all the glue blocks that retain the feet are good order. Are they original, or have there been horrible replacements where there's been no attempt to age them? I want the glue blocks underneath the feet to look old, even if they're not as old as the originals. I want them to be made in the same way. The edges, mitered. I want the restoration work to look like it has some respect for the originality of the piece of furniture. I think that's a good way to describe it. I think the restoration work has to look as if it respects the integrity of the piece of furniture.
And the other thing, again, this is interesting for our listeners. So antique furniture historically was made using animal glue, which is our hot glue that's bubbling away on the workshop top there. And in theory, pretty much take a piece of antique furniture apart using hot water to melt the glue, and the joints will be absolutely perfect. Your glue blocks will be absolutely perfect. And you could then, in theory, stick it all back together again, talking about 300 years later, because it melts with hot water. And this is the big difference between animal glue and synthetic glues. If you use PVA or polyurethane, you stuck those glue blocks in underneath the bureau, and then you try to take them out, you can't remove it. And then what happens is you then have to start planing and chiseling away at the glue, which then takes the wood away, and then it deforms the surface of the glue block, and then it doesn't go back in the right place. And so it's an absolute disaster, synthetic glue compared to animal glue. So it's just, a lot of people just don't realize that our antique furniture was stuck together with animal glue, and it's an incredible glue.
But isn't it incredible that you can reconstitute something?
Yeah.
You can soften and reconstitute something that was applied 200, 300 years ago. It's amazing how many times I've managed to. I was working recently on a lovely little French tray top table with a beautiful piece of figured mahogany, which had shrunk in places in a normal way and was lifting because the glue had crystallized. And I was able to put a warm block on some paper and clamp it flat. And when I went in the morning, the warmth of the block of wood that I'd clamped on the veneer had softened the glue, and it stuck it and was stuck down again. It was secure.
Yeah, after so many years. It's crazy,
After
isn't
all
it?
that time. Yeah, absolutely amazing. And the use of new glues is one of the most awful things because what I find is that people underestimate the skill involved in cabinet work and restoration work, and they think they can do it themselves. So they get the PVA glue, squirt it on with copious amounts, and nail the moldings back on. And they're not quite right. They haven't got it quite lined up. And then you pull the thing off, and there you are, exactly as you described it, with tons of dried up PVA glue that you can't get off unless you pull off some of the original timber underneath it. So, but this piece of furniture that you've teleported to me hasn't ever been restored.
No, it hasn't been restored. So let's go look at the cross-grain moulding that's sitting on the sides and the front. How are you going to refix those back? They're loose. So just take us through the method.
Well, I'm not going to use crosshead screws.
And your impact driver.
Which I find an extraordinary amount of plasterboard screws holding feet on and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How am I going to, what I like to do, if the whole glue needs cleaning off, I like to use a hot rag. I put a hot, damp rag so I would turn all the pieces of molding over on my bench and put a piece of hot toweling or something like that going to retain the heat. And I even use the microwave. I use the microwave to make a damp cloth nice and hot and place it over the back of the pieces of timber of the cross-grain moldings. Makes it much easier to clean the glue off. It's very difficult because a lot of those cross-grain moldings are curved.
Yep.
From shrinkage, aren't they? It's not always easy you can't always get a clamp on those things. But if I can get a clamp on them, I use a block and some newspaper or a block of wood and paper, and if possible, clamp it back on. But I don't typically like to use nails or pins or anything like that. I've got some 1-inch brads at the workshop at the moment that I found a jar of recently. And I think they're 20 gauge. They're like little thin pieces of wire. And an engineer gave me a tool, a drill bit that you use just by hand with the most incredibly thin drill bits. You can make a hole in a piece of molding like that with a drill bit that is so fragile that you'll break 3 of them trying to drill one hole. But you can put a brad in through a piece of cross-grain molding that secures it in place. You're not putting the whole thing in.
Mm-hmm.
You're just pinning it at an angle. And the secret is to pin at an angle so the piece of wood can't lift up. If you pin straight down, the piece of wood can do this on the pin.
Yeah.
So you're just barely securing it in place. But with hide glue, the glue gels so fast that it only needs to be held in by the securing pin for a few minutes. You can take the pin out. And the hole is so small that when you wax the piece of furniture, you can't see the pinhole anymore anyway. But I also like to use masking tape twisted like a bow tie and stretched around the edge of the piece of furniture. And that's beautiful because it generally doesn't leave residue if you don't leave them on for very long. But you're able to pull a piece of tape tightly around a piece of molding and just long enough for the glue to dry.
Yeah. The
No
other
invasion.
thing, for instance, with glue blocks in feet, once you're happy that your glue block is going to fit in nicely, you then apply the hot animal glue and you use a rub joint and just 1, 2,
Yeah.
3, and it literally just sticks. The friction just sticks. So
Yeah.
then once you get a really good rub joint, if you move it up, you'll probably only get about 3 sort of ups and downs, and then it stops moving and it grips. And
Yeah.
then you leave it alone because you know it's absolutely perfect. Obviously, it has to be a very good in good contact with the wood itself, doesn't it? Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it's that
Yeah,
friction,
it has to be.
and that sort of it just sucks to the wood. But that's another way, very very common way of using it. It's called a rub joint, and that's basically what you do. You rub it in, and then it stops, and that's it.
I made a huge contemporary bed, like a platform Japanese style bed, with the headboard was made of blistered maple. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It looks a bit like a burr or a burl. It's a beautiful piece of timber. And I found 2 huge planks, 2 inches thick. And when I was making it, I just wanted one joint. I wanted the bottom of the headboard to be a plank that's about 2 foot in height. And then I wanted a slight angle with another piece just very gently angled back. And I wanted one joint in the middle. And the gentleman that was helping me run it through the planer, I used a jointer on the edge and then skimmed it with a big plane, a big jointing plane. When I glued it up, he said, "But we haven't got any clamps ready." I said, "Well, we're not going to clamp it. We're just going to rub it." I did use a modern glue because I was making a new piece of furniture, but I did use modern glue. We popped it on there, and I could see that he just couldn't understand how this could possibly work. In his mind, you have to clamp everything. And I said, "No, we're just going to get it lined up. We're going to get the edges lined up perfectly. We're just going to rub it a couple of inches each way." And I think also it almost creates a vacuum where it pushes all the air out. And when there's no air in between the 2 pieces of wood, it can't pull apart. And here we are 26 years later, and that joint has never come apart. I've got
a funny story. So we were always taught to, if you're joining a tabletop together, it would always literally just be wood to wood, no biscuit joints, absolutely nothing. It would literally just use a big long jack plane, and you would joint, or we used to call it shooting as well, didn't we? You would shoot that across, and you'd get such a fantastic joint that you'd then just be able to put your glue in, either rub it together or you then could clamp it up. And that's how it was. And if you did it properly, it was incredibly strong. And that's how tables were put together. So I was making an oak table, a new oak table with a sort of a modern design, really, and a very thick top, probably about 17 millimeters thick. It's a really, really heavy top, about 8 foot in length and about 3.5 foot wide. And the glue I was using at the time was cascamite. Okay. Now that was the glue I was used to, and you mix cascamite. It's for those of you who don't know, it's a powder form. You mix it with water, and then you mix your glue like that. Then you apply it. Now the problem, which I didn't realize, was the cascamite was really old, very very old cascamite. So and this project, I was, absolutely working all the hours to get it done because it was going to be a Christmas present for her husband. So I jointed it all up, and then I was, planing the top and cabinet scraping and sanding and everything. Great. And I got it done about 3 days before Christmas. And the delivery guys came to pick it up, and they grabbed the top, and it was vertical, and they moved it horizontally to take it out of the door, and the whole thing just collapsed in the middle. It went bang.
As soon as you said delivery guys, I knew this wasn't going to end well.
and it literally just folded like a book and fell on the ground. And their faces just were looking at me.
Was this one of those? You used to make these beautiful refectory tables.
Yeah. It was one of those, but a modern sort of take on that. And anyway, this thing just literally collapsed, and the noise, bang, and then it dropped on the floor, and their faces just, honestly. So anyway, point being, I had to phone the customer up and disappoint her because her table wasn't going
This is
to
gonna
be
be
before Christmas.
It's going to be an Easter present.
Yeah, yes. But the thing is, the Cascum white was old and it didn't work.
Yeah.
It was nothing to do with my joints. It was just because it was old. And I think what it was, I used a new batch and then I ran out and then I went in the cupboard and got another batch and it was that joint that snapped.
It
So-
gets grainy, doesn't it, when it's
Yes.
old?
Yes. But I
It
didn't.
gets sort of gritty.
Yeah, I didn't know. I just didn't realise that you couldn't use old Cascum white, and that was a big, steep learning lesson. But anyway, so I thought I'd just share that story with you. Right, so
Let's go back to the bureau,
yeah,
the hypothetical bureau,
yes,
because one of the things that I always found very satisfying was replacing missing sections of cross-grained moldings.
okay,
And because they're usually an OG shape with a flute with an OG, there's a concave and a convex shape to the
Yeah.
moldings. And there's something incredibly satisfying about carving and shaping those moldings and getting them so accurately made that all you've got to do is put a little Van Dyke on them and colour them out a little bit. I've got a George II chest on chest here that I bought in England 25 years ago. And I don't know if you remember, but I went to an auction in London, and my mother came with me and wouldn't stop talking through the auction. And I bought the wrong piece of furniture.
I don't remember that story.
Well, it's so embarrassing. I've never told anybody.
Well, you have now.
So I bought a George II walnut chest on chest, and it's on my landing. It still hasn't been done.
Oh,
I paid an extraordinary amount of money for it, but every time I look at it, I think, right, I'm going to replace these cross-grain moldings. It has the most lovely cornice moldings.
wonderful.
It's a great example of restoration work that should never have been done. Whoever restored it, I sincerely hope they changed their career at some point. It needs a lot of work, which is why it's never been done. But I've put on the hypothetical bureau. I forgot to tell you, there's one of the interior drawers is missing, so we've got to make
Okay.
an interior drawer, which is a really satisfying. I love making drawers. The whole process of cutting dovetails and finding old pieces of oak, because it's oak cased, isn't it? And finding lovely pieces of thin oak to use for the drawer bottoms and the drawer casings. Yeah.
The carcass is the actual main carcass is normally Scots pine with the veneer, isn't it? And then the interior is oak.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about restoration work is the skill of sympathetic restoration, or are we going to call it forgery? What's it called when you're making a drawer for a piece of furniture, but you're using very carefully sourced timber, or timber that you've had lent up behind the bandsaw for 6 years.
Well, that's another topic, because that's, again, what do you use? Old wood, or do you use new and not colour it and allow it to dull down? You know, that's another topic that I come across all the time.
Museums call that honest restoration, don't they?
Yeah.
Where you don't make any attempt to hide the work. As far as I'm concerned, and I'm going to be, obviously during this conversation, one of us was going to say something very controversial about conservation and restoration. But one of the things that I've always thought was a bit of a cop-out was people putting unashamedly new timber in a piece of period furniture, not making any attempts to colour it out. Where's the skill in that? Anybody can replace something with new timber and do a relatively okay job of making it functional again. But I grew up learning restoration work surrounded by people who were so good at what they did. You couldn't tell that the leg was new. You couldn't tell that it had a new drawer. And using old surface in an interior drawer is very satisfying because, of course, even if you use new veneer to veneer the drawer front, you and I both know how to recreate the colour, the patina, waxy finish. We know how to do that. But what you can't do is fake oxidization of casework, drawer liners. You can't. I don't care what anybody says. You can't fake that.
You can't.
Unless you fume things for ages.
Yeah, but it still doesn't. It's not the same colour when you fume with ammonia and bichromate, potassium bichromate. But it is an interesting one. I obviously old school was to completely colour out. If you had to put a new chair on a new leg rather on a chair, Old school would definitely be, right, color match perfectly so you cannot tell the difference. It's now some people have gone too far the other way and they want it completely left. So therefore there's no stain or anything. But then you've got to think, right, if that person's paying for that project or that customer's paying for a bit of paneling that's going to be replicated and be installed, they've got to live with that. So therefore I think there's got to be a compromise here. Now I'm sort of towards the, certainly the last 5 or 6 years, I don't like to completely color everything out because I do like to see a repair. And as long as it's a really good repair, it's nice to see it. However, I always try and blend it to a similar color. So therefore it doesn't completely stick out.
But in sympathy.
Yeah, but it's also, you can just recognize that it is slightly different, but it's not going to offend anybody. And that's my approach, which seems to satisfy both parties.
Well, it's a rational and reasonable compromise, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a good compromise to have something that's beautifully done.
Yeah.
But that's probably the perfect example you just described of an honest restoration.
Yeah. But it is difficult. But
sometimes you can't. Sometimes with polish, I've explained this to many clients. When you're repolishing something like a dining table that's had some terrible damage, new polish is new polish. You can't make new polish look old. You can't repolish a dining table and have it look like it's never been repolished. It just doesn't work, does it?
No.
New polish is new polish. I think that's why not having a super shine, having a waxy finish is preferable for me. That's what I like.
Yeah. Feel the
grain and wax.
Yeah, and also the other thing a lot of people don't realize is that the polish that was put on that tabletop 200 years ago didn't come out of a tin. It was made. So it didn't come out of a bottle, and the quality is just vastly different. So
I buy Flander waxed shellac,
right,
and make my own polish, and the only way I use it differently is by adjusting the amount of alcohol in it depending on what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So I typically want a very thin polish, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because French polishing is a process rather than a product.
Yes, yeah, it's technique, isn't it?
Yeah, technique.
Yeah.
And I think all restorers have their different methods and different ideals, and mine is the best way.
So let's wrap up on our bureau, and then we're going to move on to something else. So you put the blocks, you've described how you're going to do that. And generally, your approach, I believe, is to leave a lot of it alone, leave some of the cracks and the splits, and it's 400 years old. So it's an old piece of furniture.
We're going to wax it and wax it and wax it.
Yeah.
We're going to colour out some of those repairs. I'm sorry, Vincent. We're going to colour out some of those repairs and put little dots and marks on them and make them look like they've always been there. But and we're going to seal those new pieces of wood. Yeah. But we're going to get a good, juicy, dark wax, really juicy, and rub it in because the piece of furniture is dry, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's super dry. When you get that gorgeous, warm, waxy glow, when you look at the reflection on the sides of the case, and it just walnut's one of those very rewarding things to restore, isn't it? Because they're usually dry as a bone, and that's why all the cross-grain moldings are falling off and so on. But it's also, we've got to have a handle made.
Yes.
Or look, good old Optimum brasses.
Yeah, Optimum brass. They get a mention. Optimum brass, or Marshall brass.
Beautiful. Their product is beautiful. And if you send something there, they can replicate it for a princely sum. Exactly. It's fantastic. So what else are we doing to the bureau?
I think we won't do the draw runners. I think they are sufficiently worn, but cause too much damage. So we're going to leave them as they are. And we're going to explain to the client that too much damage will be caused by repairing the draw runners. Apart from your replacement drawer that we'll have to do in another episode, I think we're pretty much done. The main thing is the piece of furniture's come in, it's been in the family for so many years, it hasn't been touched, which is always the best way. And we're conserving it. Yes, there was a bit of restoration because one of the mouldings had to be recut and put on. But apart from that, it's a lovely conservation project rather than a restoration project.
Less is more.
Right now, I want to move on. And we might do this this might be a 2-episode podcast here because I want to move on now because I'm really, really interested to find out how on earth you go about making a Chippendale chair. Where do you
I was
start?
thinking about that.
Where do you start to make, where do you start?
Well, one of the biggest problems is quality timber. Acquiring, there's no reason why any of your listeners should understand this, but when you look at the profile of a rear leg on a Chippendale chair, there's quite a sweep, and those legs were often made out of one piece of mahogany, and you need a big plank of mahogany to make one leg. So the waste of materials is considerable. But how I start making a chair like that is by making cardboard templates.
Okay.
So I would put a big sheet of white artist's cardboard on a bench or a table, put the chair on its side, and very carefully recreate templates. So I've got either Luon plywood or cardboard templates to draw onto the wood and cut the basic shapes on a bandsaw. The rear legs, the crest rail, of course, leaving ample wood to recreate carving. I think the chair that you're talking about had scallops carved into the arms of the chairs.
It also had the grapes or vines as well in the back.
Yeah,
That's what I think I remember.
Complicated chair.
Yeah.
I remember, of all the chairs I've made, I remember that chair very vividly. I also remember our boss picking up a pair of calipers from my bench and holding them
Yeah.
against one part of the chair that was very particular. The width of it had to be very particular. And he put the calipers on the old chair, the original chair. I put the calipers on my chair, and it was fortunately spot on.
Oh,
He put the calipers back on my bench and just walked away. What a job that was. But yeah, I know that I would have made, I've probably still got the templates for that somewhere.
So you make your cardboard templates out of ply or cardboard, and then you cut out the rough shape, leaving enough for carving. Okay. And then you do that with all of the legs, the rails, the back, the center splat as well.
And leaving, of course, enough room on the ends for mortise and tenon joints to be cut, for the tenons to be cut.
Then what's the next step? That's the next step.
A lot of bandsaw work. A lot of work on the bandsaw to get the basic shapes right. I mean, usually the bottoms of the legs from the seat rail down, the legs are quite often square, the rear legs, or rectangular. Yeah. The thing that's really interesting to a furniture maker about chairs is how subtle the angles are. That you might have a mortise and tenon joint, which for your viewers is usually a rectangular shaped post that goes into a mortise. This is the mortise, and this is the tenon. Often the shoulders of those joints are very, very subtle angles. And that's the sort of stuff that you have to really be careful when you're marking the joints, that you leave enough length for the angle of the shoulder of the joint. So I would start with cutting all the pieces out on a bandsaw, and I use calipers a lot. There's nothing more accurate than a caliper. You're not looking at a ruler trying to measure 3/16 or of an inch and 3/4. Or you're not with a caliper. If the caliper doesn't lie, if your rear leg is bigger than the rear leg of the original chair, the caliper will tell you that it's the right size or not. It's just spoke shaves, using convex and concave spoke shaves, which the tool that's used by cartwheel makers originally. Wheel makers would literally shave the spokes of the wheel with a spoke shave. And it's like a plane with a handle on each end, isn't it? So you use those to do the convex, the concave shapes. It's just a very, very long process. It is an extremely expensive job to recreate a chair like that, because once you've got the chair looking physically the correct shapes and dimensions. Then you've got the carving on all the arms and the crest rail and the splat. That splat, which is the centerpiece of the chair in the back, also had a cross-woven pattern. Do you remember? And
Yes.
and they were slightly concaved as well. It was like interwoven ribbon, going underneath each other.
Yeah.
So carving chisels and planes, I mean, it's just an extraordinarily complicated but an incredibly satisfying thing to do, especially when you see the finished product. And I think that I'm right in saying that Paul replicated the color of those chairs and polished it so well, it actually wasn't very easy to tell that one of the chairs was the new chair. Fantastic.
What was the quality of the mahogany? It couldn't have been Cuban that you were using, because we couldn't get hold of Cuban then,
I
could
used
we?
to go Brazilian mahogany.
Was it Brazilian mahogany? But it wouldn't have been the same quality as the original chair. They wouldn't have used Brazilian, would they? They would have used a Cuban. It would have been
Cuban
dense.
mahogany is like this. It's very dense.
Yeah.
It's very dark and very dense.
Yeah. So therefore, that's easier to carve, isn't it? It's got to be easier to carve if it's a denser wood. As in, you can get crisp carvings from it, can't you?
You especially with carving.
Yeah.
Especially with the carving, Cuban mahogany is lovely. Got to have razor sharp, but you don't get so much of the edges breaking out.
No.
With Cuban mahogany, you get a crisper cut.
So that was difficult then, because you had to use Brazilian mahogany, and that was much harder to make.
Sometimes Honduran mahogany is quite dense. It's always, and of course, it's even more difficult to get mahogany now than it used to be. There were lumber yards in upstate New York. I made a table base for a very respected dealer in Manhattan, so I won't mention his name. I made a table base for a beautiful oval Regency table. It had a little tiny slender base that was just completely period incorrect. And I made a Regency base for this table. I went up to this lumber yard north of Albany somewhere, which is the state capital. And they had planks of mahogany that were 4 and 5 inches thick. Huge planks. I bought all of it and used a considerable amount to make this table base. It was Brazilian mahogany, but it was very dense and quite figured mahogany. But it is so rare and so difficult to get that I bought as much as I could afford to buy. Just off one lump.
Going back to the did you have any? You must have made a few mistakes along the way. You couldn't have done it absolutely perfectly.
I didn't become a lawyer. That was my first fundamental mistake. Have I made mistakes?
No, I mean on the Chippendale chair, or the when you reproduce that, there must have been really challenging stages, and and did you make a mistake and then had to rectify that? Did you have to do it? Use another rail or something or other? Because
I don't think I made a mistake on that chair, because you and I were blessed to be working for somebody for whom quality was absolutely paramount. It had to be right. Mr. Kean wouldn't accept something that wasn't right, wasn't up to standard. I don't remember making mistakes on that chair, but I've made mistakes. If I'd made a mistake with, for instance, the carving, one of the beautiful things about making a new piece of furniture is you can let in a piece of wood. You're effectively restoring your restoration. You're restoring your own piece of furniture, but I don't remember making mistakes. You can't with carving, can you?
That's what I'm thinking. Just can't. And then when it comes to the carving, how does that work? Do you draw templates on? Do you use paper and card and draw templates? Draw the carving out first?
That's a really good question. Well, you can take rubbings with graphite and paper.
Right.
But for things like the splat and the crest rail was shaped from front to back. It was curved, and it was curved from side to side. Sometimes you can't take a rubbing. You can use tracing to a degree. The one thing about carving that I've experienced is that if you're carving from a rubbing and tracing, you've almost got to make it slightly bigger. It's hard to explain why, but if you stick exactly to your rubbing, which side of the line are you carving to?
Of course, yeah, of course.
The outside of the inside. So you've got to be very careful with that kind of thing. The truth is, Vincent, as you obviously know, but for the sake of people listening, the truth is you can't rush a job like that.
Mm.
And that brings us to a whole other conversation about why we almost can't afford to do our job properly, because people are always pressurizing us regarding the cost or the budget. You can't rush a job like that, because if you make a mistake, you might be making a mistake that takes you a week to rectify. If you've got to make a new back leg, or you've got to start making the splat of the chair again.
I wonder how long it took you, Mark. I wonder how long it took to make that from start to finish.
Oh, realistically, probably a month.
Yeah.
I would think a month for sure.
Amazing, isn't it?
Somebody asked me to make an armchair, an elbow chair, a Chippendale style elbow chair. Now I would probably give them a quote for bending the 6 weeks work.
Yeah.
Not bending timber.
Yeah. The other thing is, in the 18th century, the furniture making workshop, the various tasks were done by different people. So you'd have a carver, you'd have somebody preparing the wood, then you'd have a joiner, and they would all go through like a factory process, wouldn't it? From one bench to another. So therefore, there's somebody that's on ball and claw feet. That's all they did. Day in, day out.
That's an extraordinary, satisfying part of a chair to make. and often really early 18th century or mid 18th century American claw on ball foot have this gap behind the claw. They're very finely, they're with pronounced knuckles, but that's such a satisfying thing. I've restored many that have been chewed to destruction by dogs. There's nothing a dog likes more than lying down beside the dining room suite and just gently chewing on a
Bobby,
chair leg all day.
Stop chewing the leg.
Yeah. What were we talking about?
No, I just bought it. Just the fact that the quality of this furniture is outstanding. The period furniture, and you just wonder how people could make something of such high quality. But then going back to the man that makes the ball and claw feet, that's what he did for 25 years, day in, day out, and so therefore he could almost do it with his eyes shut. And it was literally repetition. That's why we see such quality.
There's something I find quite interesting about our business that remains the same today for most people who are furniture makers and restorers as it was in the 1700s, is that the bulk of our work is quite often quite mundane, and it's every now and again somebody comes along with some magnificent project or an incredible request, and you get to show off your skills. And I was thinking, when you were talking about claw on ball feet, there's some of the finest cabinet makers in America set up shop in Newport, Rhode Island in the 1700s. And my understanding is that several of those furniture makers whose furniture is in the Metropolitan Museum and in the Philadelphia Museum, they're almost like rock star pieces of furniture. That those workshops would not have survived if they weren't making caskets for the state. So they were making coffins, basic coffins. They were doing joinery and carpentry. Those amazingly talented craftsmen were doing very basic work most of the time, and then somebody would come along and say, I want a bonnet topped highboy with carved legs and claw on ball feet, and I think I dare to suggest that I share the same level of excitement that they must have done. It's like, yippee, we've got to make this beautiful. We could stop making coffins for a couple of weeks and make this beautiful piece of furniture.
Yeah, very exciting.
Yeah.
No, it's fascinating, but that was a really good insight into just how you went about it. And I remember just really being blown away that day I saw you making that chair, or the many days I saw you making that chair.
Don't we take it for granted? And I'm going to blow my own trumpet here. We're bloody clever. We're really clever. We're underappreciated. We can make these things using tools, caliper, pencil, paper. We know how to make these things, and there are very few people training to do this work. So we're back on that. If we've gone full circle, what's going to happen?
Well, this is what we're going to be discussing, because it's a huge topic. But right, I want to move on to my next thing because I just think this is interesting for us just to talk about this because, again, it just doesn't exist now. And I always get asked, what's the future of the business, the industry? And people say, how did you start? And I said, well, and I tell them about the Ship Street days. So I wanted us just to talk, we could talk about the Ship Street days and then we'll save anything regarding the future of the craft to a little bit later. But I just want to, such an interesting thing because this is literally just doesn't exist anymore. The fact that you and I were working in Brighton, in Ship Street, in that almost Dickensian type of workshop environment. It had, first, second, third floor, I believe, all stacked up on top of each other. And there were about 3 or 4 rooms per level. There were at least 12, maybe 15 or so, restorers, cabinet makers and polishers. I said it in the intro. Now, can you imagine stumbling across that now? Can you imagine? It's just...
No, it was... You're right. It was Dickensian. The working conditions were quite appalling.
Yeah.
In many respects.
It was cold. It was a bit wet in winter. It was just...
Didn't we work 7:30 till 6 or something like that?
It was a long day because we got paid a bit more money. I remember that.
Right.
Yeah, I remember.
We had the most incredible upholsterer.
Yeah.
Adam was an amazing upholsterer.
Yeah, Adam O'Sullivan.
Try to find an upholsterer like that now. People just use staple guns and glue guns. And there was a man who could stitch the upholstery, do the bolstered edges on Chippendale chair seats with a cheek full of upholstery nails.
That's it.
We'd always have a mouthful of upholstery tacks.
Yeah.
And that he could do the most beautiful hand stitch upholstery work. I've honestly never met an upholsterer that good.
Yeah.
Ever since.
Well, I hope he gets to listen to this because Adam, he was a great guy, a lovely character as well. But that's what it was like. It was just room after room, I remember, and stacked on top, and just this incredible furniture that was coming in. And it was properly sort of old school, wasn't it? It was really old school. That's how you were taught. And I couldn't do what I do now without that type of training. I couldn't have gone to a college or a university to do some type of conservation course. No way.
Different. My little experience with college-trained restorers, I don't think there's anything that beats the amount you learn in the back room of an antique dealer. And antique dealers in that day and age, this is before computers. I don't know if this is silly or not, but my take on antique dealers then and now is very different. I seem to remember in Brighton some quite scary characters in the North Lane who knew everything about furniture. They knew what they were looking at. Just from experience and from reference books and so on. When you work in the back rooms for those kind of dealers, you learn so much. They know what they're talking about. And there are still dealers like that, but they're old and they're closing their shops. They're surviving.
But it's a shame, isn't it? Because if these places still exist, the reason they don't exist, obviously, is because the antique trade just stopped pretty much. It just got less and less when the American market went, and then it was just very difficult. And then the antique furniture now is much cheaper to buy, and it just completely dropped. So that's hence why these places don't exist. But there's one story I need to tell, because this is one of my memories of Ship Street. In the summer, we had all the windows open. So on the 3 floors, we had the windows open. Now, bearing in mind, the alleyway was just below us. And do you remember, if we heard clip, clop, the heel of a stiletto shoe, we'd all rush to the window and look out down below. And then you look up and you see everybody, all the restorers looking out the window. You literally will be carving a piece of wood, and then all of a sudden, clip, clop,
You'd abandon
everything
what you were
tools
doing.
down, abandon, and then straight out the window. That's one of my memories.
We weren't as politically correct as we have to be now.
No, exactly. But that was funny.
There was also prolific singing and whistling.
Yes.
And shenanigans.
There was. There really was.
A lively place. I can remember teasing, especially of young trainees. Was brutal.
Yeah, it was.
Utterly brutal.
It was. And we can't go into some of that because, I mean, if that happened now, wow.
Human resources.
Absolutely. This is one of the things that we'll talk about, but that you had to be tough in that environment as a youngster, and you had to stick up for yourself. And that was part of your training. It was, I do also remember one very funny day talking about the things we used to get up to, and there was quite a bit of laughter and a bit of mucking around going on. But I remember one day you were at your workbench and you had your back facing the door. Now, Mr. Keane used to come round on regular, well, once a day he would walk around, and he was so quiet, wasn't he? He didn't say anything to anybody. He would just very quiet. Yeah, very, very quietly would just walk from one room to another, open a door very quietly to the next one, and he would say good morning, good afternoon. And that's it. That's all you got from him. And I remember you at your bench, and we were just mucking around and singing, and I had seen him come through the door and you hadn't, and you were singing this song at the top of your voice and really going crazy, and he came through, and then you saw him and you looked round and he looked at you. He had very fine voice today, Mark. And I remember you went bright red, and then he just turned around and walked
sweating.
out. Yeah, you started sweating.
It's quite extraordinary. I've never been fired. Mike Keane had every reason to fire me at least once a year for 7 years. But I think we were captives in it was a bit like an old galleon. It was appropriate that it was called Ship Street, because it was like an old ship, wasn't it? But the whistling and the singing and the banter going on between the workshops.
I know. It's a lovely memory of mine working there, and I got taught some incredible stuff there. So it's lovely. But
the thing about woodworking skills and restoration and conservation and furniture making, the truth of it is that it's largely self-taught.
Yeah, you're right.
You can only be taught so much. And even now, I just had to rebuild a chair. The chair had 2 carved rails at the back, and one of them had been snapped in the middle, and it had snapped both tenons off each end. And I was trying to work out how to restore the rail that had been broken. And I realized I had to dismantle the whole chair in order to restore this rail or stretcher and put the chair back together. And I was thinking, there's never a point at which you can say, okay, you've learned this, you've finished learning. You never finish learning.
No.
You always have to use your initiative, and there's so much improvisation involved with doing serious restoration work, structural restoration work. So you don't stop learning, but hopefully you're locked in a room for 7 years with somebody that you learn something useful.
And it's true. And the other thing is that you don't get good at your craft without making multiple mistakes. You know, when I left fairly early, I think I was only about 21 or something when I left, and then he did a bit of traveling, then came back and set up self-employed, you know, so I wasn't, you know, really ready to go and run my own business and be self-employed. So during that time, as you say, I was self-taught in many respects. I learned, you know, the fundamentals and the basics, and then I had to go out and teach myself. Yeah. And the amount of mistakes, it's, you know, for any young people that are listening to this who are thinking getting into a trade, you know, and a specialist craft, you have to make so many mistakes to get good. And that's the only way you learn.
I think you're right.
You know,
and I think, interestingly, sometimes you learn the best way by the hardest possible route.
Yeah.
It's just
Absolutely.
sometimes disastrous. I mean, the only thing I can remember in many years of restoration work that I could have cried about was that I broke a plate mirror in one of those double dome bookcases, those walnut
Oh,
bookcases,
oh,
and I was pinning the backboards back on the door,
oh no.
and I had the door facing away from me, and I just heard this click. I thought,
Oh no.
I hope that wasn't what I thought it was. And I turned the door around and felt nauseous when I
Oh,
thought holes cracked right across the top of the mirror plate.
that I can't imagine what that was like.
I remember thinking that if Mr. Kean hears about this, I'm going to be fired. And I remember apologizing profusely to him. And he was such a sweetheart about it. He was fine. Accidents happen.
Oh,
But what an awful accident. It was the original mirror plate.
the original mirror glass.
So now nobody will ever call me. From this point on, nobody will ever call me to do restoration work again. But
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I've just shot myself in the foot.
No. Oh,
But so I learned from that experience.
yes. Yeah.
To be absolutely doubly sure. I think what had happened was the back panel of oak, the one on the back of the door, had shrunk so much that I barely had any meat to pin into.
Mm.
And I think that's, instead of catching the edge of the wood, the rebate for the mirror, I caught the edge of the mirror.
Well, if it's any comfort, I did that about 2 months ago on a Victorian window. I just had it reglazed and I was putting the mouldings back and my pin was too long, just a tad too long. And the one last tap with the pin hammer, and I heard the same thing. And it was just about to go back to the customer. Luckily, it was not a lovely foxed 18th century mirror, but nevertheless, you're still making mistakes. We've got a couple more things to discuss. You okay?
For your viewers, it's 20 Fahrenheit in Catskill, 20 degrees, super cold.
20 degrees.
So for a gentleman with no hair.
What's that in Celsius? Cold. What's 20 degrees in Celsius?
Way below freezing.
Right. Well, that brings us on nicely, Mark, to America, because this was just your move to the States and, your experience of working in Sotheby's and just so how did
I end up in the States?
Yeah, so you left obviously the UK, Henfield, I believe you're living, or Brighton, and then went to the States. And then did you get actually offered a job at Sotheby's and then went over, or what was the story?
I've had to recount this story so many times. I've managed to edit it from a 3-hour story to a 3-minute story. So I met Sue and we went around the world for a year and a half traveling. And when we stopped in Oregon, when we eventually got to the United States, we stopped in Oregon and stayed with a family who Sue had been friends with for many years. I think she taught English in Cyprus and got to know them in Cyprus. And it became very apparent very quickly that we would need a lot more money in America than we needed in Indonesia. We traveled through Southeast Asia for 6 months, and you could be there for so long with very little money. But in America, we needed money. And I was leafing through one of those fancy magazines, and I saw either an advertisement or an editorial about Sotheby's restoration. So I phoned them and asked this lady if I could speak to the president of the company, and she said, "Let me see if he's available." I mean, So this gentleman came on the phone, and I said, "Who am I speaking with, please?" He said, "I'm the president of the service." And so I quickly gathered myself together. He said, "How can I help you?" And now I had been told that you have to be very bold in America. If you've got a window of opportunity, you have to be very bold. So I said to him, "I'm a highly talented furniture restorer. I think you need to meet me." And And instead of laughing and putting the phone down, he said, well, then we want to meet you. How quickly can you get? So being fundamentally lazy at that point in my life, I decided that the only way I would want to go across the United States was on a train. So I think the train was from Portland, Oregon, or Seattle. Can't remember. But I took a train across the country through the Glacier National Park and Chicago, and then arrived in New York. At that time, Sotheby's had a group of workshops in Spanish Harlem, I think, in the Bronx, and they also had a group of beautiful workshops in a little town called Claverack, which is near Catskill and Hudson. So they gave me a choice. They said, where do you want to come? And I said, well, I'm going to arrive in Hudson. They said, we've got workshops in Hudson or Manhattan. So I ended up going for an interview, and they said, how quickly do you want to go back to England? Would you like to do a little work? So I stayed for a week and did some work for them. And then the week turned into 3 or 4 weeks or something like that, and was ready to leave. I'd got some money in my pocket. I was ready to go back to England and get my van and then go touring in Europe. And they said, hold on a minute, we'd like to offer you a job. Would you like to come and work for us? And at the time, Sue and I had rented out the house in England. And they said, our legal department will help you with visa requirements and that sort of thing, which even then was very difficult for somebody in our business to acquire. But after 3 months later, I had an H1B visa and went from Spain back to England, put all my tools in a box. A truck came along, took all my tools away, and I was on the next plane out of England. And I worked for Sotheby's. They were very helpful with the visa things, and they rented somewhere for me to rent. They found somewhere for me to stay. So I was able to move into this little tiny house in the middle of nowhere, which I arrived at about 1 a.m, one dark, wintry November night. The cottage was in the middle of a field. So this car picked me up from JFK, drove through the night, pulled up down this muddy lane. The first thing I did was get out of the car and fall in a ditch. And then I managed to find the pathway to the cottage, and it had been previously rented to a group of hunters. And I could see this thing, this dark thing in the night, just this sinister. I thought it was somebody standing there. I put my hand out, and it was a deer hanging from the tree outside the house. So I went into my house, and it smelt of beer and cigarettes. It was quite extraordinary. But anyway, that's how I ended up in America. I ended up in America by simply being very bold and asking. It was a classic example of be careful what you ask for. Or if you want something, you really have to ask for it, because it won't happen otherwise.
And was it just antique furniture restoration at Sotheby's?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember them. I mean, there were similar jobs where, the chair. I remember there was a gentleman there who made chairs. So there would be a set of 7 and one chair missing, and a big group of craftspeople. They had Japan lacquerwork restorers. They had a fantastic gilding department who would restore gold leaf and the most stunning mirrors. They had a very talented group of people working there. And then it became Sotheby's closed up a lot of their departments. And a gentleman's name is Colin Stair. He bought Sotheby's Restoration, and it's still a restoration shop and a very increasingly well-known and respected auction house in Hudson. So I worked there for a year and a half, I think.
Oh, okay.
But not very long.
And then left on your own accord?
Yeah. I just felt that in my career, I had learnt to not just be a craftsman, but I'd also learnt, how to deal with clients and how to do estimates and quotations and condition reports and analysis, treatment. And, I'd learnt to do all of that. And at Sotheby's, it was quite clear that they wanted to keep my skills on the bench. And I wanted more than that. I wanted to be out there getting business and doing business. And so I've enjoyed, 24 of the 26 years I've been here, I've been self-employed.
Yeah. So you left Sotheby's and then set up self-employed?
Yeah, I found a barn to work in. And isn't that extraordinary how many craftspeople there are tucked away on farms where nobody ever knows they're there? You know, they arrive, they go through, the door closes, and they're doing their work in there. So I worked in a barn with no heating and no sanitary facilities, nothing, for a couple of years. And then I bought a very large building in Catskill, 5,000 square foot building. And it was uninhabitable for a year, but I said it used to be a dental practice. And in the 3 large rooms that were the dental practice, we pulled the chairs out and the gas lines and all that stuff and turned it into a beautiful restoration studio. And spent 15 years restoring the house and having kids and, just doing that adventurous thing. And so now my work studio is 200 yards down the street from where that house was.
And did you just advertise locally and started restoring people's furniture? And is that the main part of your job?
I didn't do any advertising. I suppose one would call it self-promotion. I'll tell you a little bit of a funny story. I won't name the dealer, but there's a lot of antique shops in Hudson, less now than there used to be. But I used to regularly walk past this antique shop who always had very nice pieces of furniture. Great taste, great window displays. They had lovely things, but their furniture restoration was shocking. And one day I walked past there and saw these runs of shellac down the legs of a chair. And I thought, I can't stand this anymore. So I just went back to my car and got my business cards. And I walked into the shop and said to this lovely lady, "My name's Mark Cooper, and I am a really good furniture restorer. I think you need me. Who does your restoration work?" She said, "My husband."
Yeah, you should have thought about that one before.
So that was one of my least successful self-promotions.
Did you then say, "Well, I think it's marvellous, including the drips"?
I left very quickly. But anyway, I would typically, I would say I get most of my work from friends of clients.
Right.
You know, I've just restored a couple of tables for a lovely couple in Hudson. And, 5 minutes later, got a phone call from some friends of theirs who had stayed the weekend and had seen my work. And I had an antique shop in Hudson for 6 years and thought it would be very difficult to restart the restoration business or to make the restoration business my primary business. Well, I've accepted a wider variety of work as well. I've been doing some restoration work on, I think I told you this, I did some restoration work on some beautiful historic houses. And that's an ongoing part of my business that I never anticipated. But somebody had a problem with a beautiful pair of front doors, with the original front doors for the house. And we discussed the appropriate types of treating them, which was why your last podcast was very interesting to me, because you and the gentleman who was using linseed paints,
Mahil,
we're talking about the type of options and problems and so on that are associated with finishes on houses. So I've been restoring doors and I've been restoring furniture. I've got 14 chairs in my studio at the moment from different clients. And so I'm up to here with chairs, but I thought it would be very difficult to find business and start all over again. But what I've been finding is that people can't find good restorers. And perhaps in slight contradiction to anything I've said earlier, there are people who have beautiful furniture, who have inherited furniture, who have the disposable income to do the work properly, not only do they have the money to do the work properly, they actually want to have it done properly. You know, I find that there are people who really don't understand and don't care and just want to spend as little as possible, and it's never cheap enough for some of those people. But there are quite a lot of people who are educated, informed, have inherited beautiful furniture, want to know more about it, and more importantly, want to have it handled professionally and treated professionally, and know that the work that they've had done on it is not detrimental to the emotional value and the financial value of the piece of furniture. So yeah, so it's been an interesting journey being in America, and I think it's very easy. It's very easy in my mind to say this is an American problem, but I think that the problems related to conservation versus restoration, the financial side of the business, you know, the quality of the dealers, the quality of the furniture, I don't think it's limited to a particular country. I think it's probably a problem that is global. Yeah, absolutely. But just not buying. I can remember pieces of furniture in the city, $150,000 sets of chairs. A clock I restored, a tall case clock for a gentleman in Manhattan who collected clocks. He had a 2-floor apartment in Park Avenue. There were clocks everywhere. On the hour, everything started chiming. And he bought a clock in Stockholm, at Sotheby's in Stockholm, that was delivered to my workshop in William Street in Catskill. It was a $1 million $1 million clock. Not because of the case, but because the movement was so rare. It had this extraordinarily complicated but rare movement. I haven't seen that level of collector for many years now. You know, those collectors who's passionate and knowledgeable. You know, he was a lawyer and just had this obsession with very rare clocks. It's changed. The business has changed.
It is. But what do you think? Because this, leads on to my next topic. Really, is about the future of the industry. Now, it's with me. I went from furniture restoration into architectural joinery restoration, and it's an absolute travesty if we can't get furniture that's going to be very well restored. That's one thing. But then it's another level if our buildings, also the woodwork within our buildings starts to fall apart and nobody's there to restore those. So I don't know what the answer is, but going back to my training, being in that workshop in Ship Street and being taught by you, next to you on the bench, as I said before, I couldn't do what I do now if it wasn't for that training. But those places don't exist. And also a lot of the youngsters are doing less and less hands-on work now. So what is the future? And, what could we do? One of the things that I would love to do is just record as much as possible. If I lived close to you, I'd be round to yours and I'd be filming you restoring a piece of furniture and asking you questions to try and document as much as I possibly could for future generations.
Extraordinarily flattering compliment. And,
well, the thing is, Mark, it's just we're when we retire, there's nobody coming through now that has this similar, experience of training.
I remember working in Ship Street, and I remember talking to an old gentleman in one of the polishing rooms, who always arrived at work with a shirt and tie, shiny shoes, and when he left at the end of the day, there was never a drop of polish on him, never a drop of polish on. It was old school, craftsman, proud of his work and brilliant at his work. And I remember then, when I was probably in my late 20s, I remember talking to him and watching him work one day, and I remember thinking, when this old gentleman dies, he's going to take these extraordinary skills with him. Then what? And now we're in the same position.
Yeah.
When I wouldn't say I've taught you or Adam or any of these other young people that worked alongside me, but I've perhaps influenced them
Oh, incredibly.
to do the work with conscience
Yep.
and think about what they're going to do. I mean, I often say to people, restoration work, more importantly, is about knowing what not to do with
Yeah.
a piece of furniture. Knowing what not to do with something is, I think, more important than knowing what to do with it.
Yes.
Because
Absolutely.
not doing something to it could be more important to its longevity
Mm.
and its honesty and its integrity than anything else. But I do fear for the future of our respective businesses, because I don't think the courses, I mean, thank goodness there are restoration and conservation courses available to people, because if that wasn't there either, then we'd be in double the trouble.
Yep.
The Western College used to be a source of people who were taught to be very conscious. And
Yep.
I've met a number of people that taught at Western College. I don't know if they still run a
Yeah, they do.
restoration course.
Yeah, I think they do.
Well, thank goodness for that, because we need more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly in the event of our new world of AI, because
oh my goodness,
it's people that have the skills with their hands and to be able to do this type of work that are going to be in employment. AI can't take our jobs away. Possible. So that's another reason why maybe it will help the industry. The fact that other people will just find themselves that needing to get more of a hands-on, just generally the trades and everything, you know.
I rather like the idea that there are some things that human beings can do that can't be done by AI or any other electronic technological wonders. I just think there are things that you can only do by sight and touch, feel, and with polishing, smell as well. There are all your senses are involved with producing and arriving at the destination you really want to arrive at when you're working with polishing something. How you want it to look. I don't believe, I may be wrong, but I don't believe that it's possible to recreate that mechanically or automatically.
No,
because when you're polishing something, you can feel the rubber. You can feel the rubber of when you're French polishing something. You can feel whether it's sticking. You can feel whether you want to. I don't use linseed oil with my polishing. I use an atomizer with denatured alcohol in it to stop the bottom of the pad getting too sticky. Then I can continue polishing, and I can get a very thin. Polish, effective polish using that. But you can't. You can see how a machine could sense that. Press harder, press less hard, spray with alcohol, put more. No. It's something that is actually really hard to teach someone else. I think polishing is actually one of those things that's very hard to teach somebody, because it's feel, isn't it? It's all about feel and smell, sniffing the pad to see if it's actually got enough spirit in it.
Yeah.
You came over to my workshop once.
Yeah.
You came over to my workshop once. Do you remember that cabinet I made with 32 panes of glass in it? And I couldn't get the color right on the top. And you came over with some aniline colors, and we made bacon sandwiches on the wood-burning stove, and probably smoked a rolled-up cigarette. And it was one of those days where I couldn't do it. I didn't know how to get the color right. We had two different colored pieces of mahogany, and I couldn't get the top right. And you came along and taught me how to do that with aniline stains, which I had no experience with.
Yeah.
Bringing us full circle to the fact that we cannot stop learning.
Oh, no, not at all.
And if ever we decide that we can't learn anymore, I think that would be a very arrogant.
Even after all these years, I treat myself as a novice. You know, that's how I approach things. That I'm new to it. I'm a novice, because you can never stop learning, and always put your hand up if you don't know something. Keep learning.
Keep asking questions.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So we're coming up to the end now, Mark. Now, your dedication to this specialist trade is truly inspiring. So before we close, what would you say, just, a couple of things, maybe the most fulfilling thing about your work, in a few sentences, the most fulfilling thing for you?
I thought about this recently, and a couple of weeks ago, my father, my paternal father who lives in Spain, he died on the 25th of November, and he was an extraordinarily difficult man, but he was an extraordinarily clever man as an artist. And his vision with houses was incredible. He could rebuild farmhouses and move beams and replace beams. And he would learn as he went. But he was an incredible. I said to my family, I lost my train of thought a little bit. Can we go back?
Yeah. What was your question? Let me get back. It's just, what's most fulfilling about your work?
Oh, okay. So I was going to get to the point about legacy.
Yeah.
That's how I got thinking about my father. And I was thinking, I'm so glad that I followed a path that undoubtedly leaves probably hundreds of pieces of furniture out there in the world that have been looked after properly, restored properly. Sometimes I go back to those houses to wax a table or, to refresh something. But I do feel very sincerely that I've left if I were to meet my maker tomorrow, there are pieces of furniture I've made that are in people's houses being used.
Yeah, wonderful.
There's a beautiful bronze bust in a house in Catskill that cost a considerable amount of money. And they wanted me to make a white rectangular box for it to stand on. I said, no, you can't do that. You can't have this stunning contemporary bronze that was made by a woman in Woodstock, 20 miles away. You can't put her work on a white wooden box. And I looked around the house, and it was clear that they had a passion for Biedermeier furniture. So I got a big book from the library about Biedermeier furniture, and I found a table that I could adapt and change the design of it. It was one of those lovely swoopy columns, and I made this stunning table for this bronze bust to stand on with 14 radial veneered top of 14 pieces of fiddleback sycamore.
Oh.
And I often look at pictures of that piece of furniture that just, when I've gone, there are lots of pieces of furniture like that I've made that are going to be around way after me. And I think it's important, not always possible perhaps, but I think it's important to know that you've done something useful with your time, even if you didn't make a lot of money.
Absolutely.
You got a lot of satisfaction about what you did on a day-by-day basis.
And a privilege to be one of the last, the generation, sort of true craftsmen. That's the other thing. These youngsters now can't enjoy what we've experienced because the times have changed. So that's how I look at it. It's just a privilege to have been part of that. Yeah. And very much for me, it was the tail end of it, but it was still part of that. And that's what I think about as well.
Yeah. I used to do open studios at the house. And when I was making that piece of furniture for the bronze bust, the most common question was, how do you get the veneer to stick to a table base that's that shaped? And I often say to people, well, actually, I didn't know when I made it. I didn't know how I was going to veneer it. I don't have a vacuum bag or anything like that. I put it on with hide glue and a veneer hammer. And you show people a veneer hammer with a brass strip, and they can't get their head around.
No.
You can get this veneer to stick to the shape like that. And it's lovely, this reflection. It's lovely to reflect on the fun times in the workshop, for one thing, but the pieces of furniture that we've handled, because it kind of reminds me that it hasn't been a waste of time. It's been time well spent, and not only appreciating the people that made the furniture originally, but actually treating it and giving it a new lease of life for another 200 years.
No, it's wonderful.
It's very.
Do you have any recommended resources, like books, one of your favourite books, just for listeners that are eager to learn, more about this specialist trade, books or videos or anything like that? Would you?
That's a hard one. I mean, the computer that I'm talking to you on is standing on a 2-foot stack of books about antique furniture, American furniture. I would say surround yourself with go to the library and surround yourself with books of the period of furniture that you like.
Yeah.
and look at how furniture was made rather than how it looks when it's finished.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't have any Bibles
No.
of cabinet making. I don't have any. I just have reference book that are more to do with the history of furniture than anything else.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay, so well, look, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and experience with us. It's been such a privilege for me, and it's been a privilege
for inviting me.
No, it's been fantastic and such a privilege, to learn from you. And just actually, before we say goodbye, can you just let people know where they can find more about you and your business? And
yeah, Instagram. So even an old fellow like me has an Instagram page, and I
didn't know that, Mark. I'm going to look you up.
Rather confusingly, my Instagram page is called Cooper and Company Hudson.
Okay.
Cooper and Company Hudson.
Brilliant.
And even though I'm not in Hudson anymore, I was going to change the name of my Instagram page, and I thought that's just going to confuse everyone. I've got 1,000 followers or whatever I've got. But my phone number and my email address is on that Instagram page.
Wonderful. Well, I'm hoping that some of our American listeners will be tuning in, and
they'll either be hiring me or calling me to shout at me. I hope I wasn't too controversial.
Not at all. Not at all. We love controversy. We love it.
It's very easy to criticize, but it's also important. And I think one of the things we've touched on that's important is the resource of education about restoration and antiques. I might dare to say that those are very limited resources.
Well, look, this has been fantastic. We're going to include all of the details of your Instagram account in our episode notes. And again, this has been absolutely fantastic for me to interview you. Who thought we'd be doing this 30 years ago? And it's been a real pleasure.
We missed a chunk of each other's lives there, where I now have when you met my son earlier, when he was being the technical wonder.
Yeah.
He's 24. You met him when he was 3 months old or something.
Yes.
He's 24 now. So
well, I think
a chunk of time.
Yes, I know.
This is wonderful, and it's a great way not just to reminisce, but to communicate to the people out there.
Yep. Absolutely, and have this as a recording. It's so good. And when we were talking, I've just been thinking, great, we can maybe do another episode on that particular subject. There's so much to talk about, so it would be really great to get you back in the future.
If you get positive feedback, I'm very happy. You can tell I'm happy to talk.
No, it's wonderful. We that's what we want. We absolutely want, because I want to record as much of your knowledge as we possibly can. Well, look, okay.
My first experience on a podcast, so I hope your listeners understand that I'm a novice at this.
No, you're fantastic. It's been great. So look, thanks so much again, and goodbye for now, Mark. Thanks a lot.
Toodle pip, Vincent. Lovely to chat with you.
Okay, bye-bye.